It's November 20th, 1943. About 18,000 Marines are heading towards Batio, a small island a part of the Tarawa Atoll in the South Pacific Ocean, only about 2 miles long and 800 yards wide. They look out onto the thin strip of land as their naval ships bombard the island with hundreds of shells, periodically holding fire to allow the air support and dive bombers to make their rounds in order to target Japanese fortified positions more accurately. This routine had been put into place every day for about half a week leading up to the invasion to soften enemy forces, as this had worked greatly to decrease casualty rates and made for a smoother landing in previous battles. As the Marines watch as such a small island gets absolutely obliterated by shells and artillery, they are doubtful that there could be any form of life still left by the time they were due to invade. After breakfast and morning prayer, the men load the Amtraks and head for the beach, confident that the naval bombardment had done its job and left them with an easy cleanup, expecting little to no resistance on the beach, and at most, clearing out the last remaining pockets of Japanese defenders that may have somehow survived the barrage. They don't know it yet, but these Marines are soon to approach the most heavily fortified island in the Pacific theater up to this time, and possibly the entire war. Morale is high up to this point. As they push toward the beach, they have no reason to believe the bombing campaign wouldn't do what it was promised. It is a 6,000-yard journey from the naval cruisers to the island, but for a couple thousand yards, the men would endure no issues from the Japanese. That is, until they reach about the halfway mark. All at once, the enemy fires artillery from every intact position, pouring down on the vulnerable LVTs in the water from all directions. Then, at about 2,000 yards from the beach, the Japanese utilized their mortars and machine gun fire. They had successfully set their trap and lured the Americans in, who had believed the enemy had been wiped out from their 3-day shelling. Their plan to wait and hold fire until the Americans were within range of their artillery had worked in their favor, launching an effective and brutal surprise attack. To make matters worse, the rising smoke from these attacks had effectively hidden the Japanese and is used as a cover, preventing the US from being able to take out their firing positions from the air or sea when the Marines need it most. Despite this initial chaos, several Amtraks make it to the beach while many others are torn to pieces thousands of feet from shore, along with many unlucky passengers. Men pour out of the LVTs as they hit the beach, frantically looking for any cover. Pinned down from unrelenting machine gun fire, hundreds of Marines are crowding the beach along the seawall, unsure of their next move and now fighting for their lives on foreign soil. This would end up being only the first morning of an almost 4-day battle, and things would only get worse as time progressed. Although incredibly risky and often with high casualty rates, this method of landing on the beach under constant stress and taking the enemy head on would become the most common way that the US military would tackle the island hopping campaign. This nightmare scenario would repeat itself battle after battle until the war in the Pacific was over, following the Japanese surrender in September of 1945. But how did the Americans decide that this way of invading enemy territory would become the most necessary or effective? To understand it more clearly from their perspective, it's important to take a look at their victory at Guadalcanal, which is essentially what led them to this conclusion. The Japanese landed at Guadalcanal, an island just northeast of Australia and the largest of the Solomon Islands, in April of 1942 as part of their push through Southeast Asia in the late 30s and early 40s, quickly beginning to construct an airfield there to aid them in future offensives against any opposing forces. And by this time in the war, those opposing forces would be the US troops and their allies. The Japanese had placed strongholds all throughout the southern Pacific, taking the Philippines after Pearl Harbor and several islands east to establish airfields and bases for their armies. The Americans had yet to take any of this land back, left constantly in the defensive as the Japanese made the push through greater territory to expand their empire. But by August of 1942, the Japanese did have a few crippling losses along the way. Most notably, would be their defeat at Midway in June of the same year, losing four aircraft carriers that were extremely crucial for their naval fleet to maintain its superiority. To make matters worse, 248 planes would be shot down carrying mostly highly experienced pilots that were seen as irreplaceable assets for the Japanese Navy. However, none of this would compare or turn the tide of the war overall quite like a large scale amphibious operation, like the US takeover of Guadalcanal and its surrounding islands. These landings would essentially kill two birds with one stone, preventing the Japanese from hindering Allied supply lines to Australia and New Zealand, while at the same time allowing the Americans to establish their own airstrip to launch offensives against enemy strongholds in nearby islands. We would finally be able to initiate our own methodically planned attacks to truly give them some resistance for the first time and drive them right back to their homeland. The American assault on Guadalcanal would be set for the morning of the 7th of August, 1942. Unlike the hectic situation at Tarawa, the initial landings would take the Japanese by surprise due to bad weather conditions, so there'd be little to no defenders on the beach. Because of this easy landing, the Americans took the airfield relatively quickly and in days were able to form a thin perimeter around it. Although they had the airfield, taking the rest of the island would not be so easy. The battle went on for months as the Marines engaged in brutal close quarters combat with their enemy. By the end of the ordeal, 7,000 Marines were either killed or wounded, but Japanese losses were devastating, with over 25,000 dead, either killed in action, succumbed to disease, or starved due to poor supply lines and preparation. This not only gave the Americans a morale boost that they so desperately needed, but also gave them a taste of what battle on land would consist of and how to prepare for future assaults. If Tarawa was to be occupied by the US, next would be an invasion of the Marshall Islands. These islands would be the next clear stepping stone for the US to make its way up to mainland Japan, and capturing them would be crucial for the US to proceed as planned. The Japanese had an impressive and well protected air base on the Marshall Islands, having decades to establish a stronghold. This is because the Japanese took ownership of these islands during World War I as part of the South Seas Mandate, given to them by Germany. This was not the case for Tarawa and the Gilbert Islands, having only occupied them just days after the attack of Pearl Harbor. This led the Americans to believe that the invasion of Tarawa, what they had assumed was a much less fortified island, would be a walk in the park. They also realized it was close enough to the Marshall Islands to give the Marines some much needed support for the duration of the campaign. Regardless, it had to be taken. After the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign, the next mission would be to take the Marianas, including Saipan and Guam, then up to Iwo Jima. By that point, the Americans would cover enough ground in their island hopping strategy to make bombing runs on Tokyo. This pathway that the US troops took was primarily led by Admiral Chester Nimitz, while Douglas MacArthur would lead his men through New Guinea and take back the Philippines as promised. However, it goes without saying that every tiny island the US managed to occupy held significant importance in capturing the next, and the Japanese would fight fanatically on every piece of land along the way, making the Marines pay for every inch. The Battle of Tarawa would end up being the first true test for the United States to see how efficiently they would be able to manage a well prepared and deeply entrenched enemy. There would be many new tactics, weapons, and machinery, but unfortunately, with that comes many unnecessary casualties. Marines and members of the Imperial Japanese Army would become the guinea pigs for this new age of war, and many would pay the ultimate price. A great deal of the plans for a swift victory in the events leading up to the battle and initiation would be flawed from the start. The US had exhausted much of their time and energy on the bombing campaign in the days leading up to the battle, throwing everything they had at it, expecting to approach a flattened, burned piece of land with little to no occupants, essentially attempting to wipe the island off the face of the earth. What they had failed to realize was just how diligently the Japanese had worked to build up the island in preparation for an invasion. The Japanese had begun fortifying the island in September of 1942, allowing them over a year to perfect all shelters and hideouts with thick concrete walls that could take hits from artillery and dive bombers. Needless to say, the Americans had their work cut out for them when they later pushed inland, realizing that just about every Japanese stronghold was intact, consisting of interconnecting pillboxes and machine gun nests that were strategically placed and hidden all around the island. One other issue with the bombing campaign at the start was a lack of communication and proper planning between naval cruisers and planes. Just as the first few waves of Amtraks were heading to the beach, the plan was for the naval bombardment to come to a stop in order for one last wave of air support to strike the island immediately after. But these planes were late. This gave the Japanese about a 20-minute window to quickly exit their fortified shelters and man their positions to fire on the Americans. Despite the heavily guarded beaches and incoming artillery, the first wave of landings had gotten a decent amount of the LVTs onto the beach, allowing the Marines to rush out and take cover. It wasn't until the second wave of reinforcements had attempted to make their way to the beach shortly after that one of the biggest and overlooked problems of the entire operation had finally revealed itself: low tides. Prior to the invasion, US generals had been warned that the tides around the coral reef may be too low for certain landing craft to navigate, giving it about a 50-50 chance. But instead of postponing the invasion, they were willing to take that risk. The first wave of LVTs were able to make it over the coral reef as they were specially made to trek through deep or shallow waters with no issue. The second wave was not so lucky. They had to ride Higgins boats, which were less durable and needed 4 feet of water minimum in order to make it across. The tides at this time were expected to be about 5 feet, giving them enough space to clear the reef. However, the tides stood still at just 3 feet, causing them to get stuck at about 5 to 800 yards from shore. With no other viable option, the ramps were lowered here, and the Marines were forced to make the walk through the water in the open, taking Japanese machine gun fire or drowning from dips in the coral due to their heavy gear. Because of the mistake made by their own generals, the troops themselves would have to pay for this devastating miscalculation. Hundreds of men would be cut down in the water before ever even setting foot on the beach or being able to take a single shot at the enemy. Even though bombing the island did not go nearly as expected, the Americans would soon find out that it unintentionally helped them greatly and prevented a Japanese victory due to two very important reasons. On day one of the battle, the naval bombardment had killed the commander of the entire Japanese garrison on the island, Admiral Shibazaki, along with all of his senior officers. Another reason would be that the Allied bombing had destroyed the electrical lines throughout the island, blocking any communication between different enemy units. These painful realizations caused the Japanese to be disorganized and in total disarray for the remainder of the battle, and this would save many American lives. By the first night of the battle, about 5,000 US troops were able to make it to the beach with limited reinforcements and backup, as many tanks and larger vehicles would be stuck on the coral reef, hundreds of yards away, unable to make it ashore. They had anticipated a Japanese counterattack throughout the night, as this would have been a perfect chance for the enemy to inflict heavy casualties. But because of the communication lines being destroyed, planning an attack would have been nearly impossible. This would give the Marines some much needed break after the bloody landing. In the morning after day one, the tides had risen and allowed reinforcements to come ashore. Higgins boats and Sherman tanks would come to their aid, and now the men would finally have enough backup to begin moving inland and taking out enemy positions one by one to turn the tide of the battle in their favor. But now on foot, the remainder of the battle would not be as easy as the Americans had hoped. The Japanese used coconut logs to build maze like structures around the island to prevent the Marines from advancing quickly to certain points. Strategically placed near the tight corners and pockets of these structures would be machine gun nests to catch the Americans off guard and cut them down before they could react. Mines were littered around the island and would become a subtle death trap for the Marines. These mines also worked perfectly to disable incoming tanks on land or Amtraks, as they were also placed in the shallow waters to kill or severely wound its operators in the process. In some cases, Japanese snipers would tie themselves to the tall palm trees around the island and pick off American troops until they would eventually be discovered and killed in a suicidal last ditch effort. The Marine casualties were mounting, constantly in fear and moving to new positions repeatedly, as any spot for cover can turn deadly in a moment's notice. Once the troops can get close enough to them, grenades and tanks were often used as an effective way to take out enemy pillboxes, but one weapon would become the most valuable for taking out these strongholds and inflicting an unbelievably surprising amount of damage: the flamethrower. Although incredibly dangerous for its users, this terrifying weapon was undoubtedly the most efficient way to quickly neutralize their emplacements. This would become the first battle that the flamethrower would show its true potential for use in future engagements throughout the remainder of the war. After 76 grueling hours fighting day and night, the Marines had finally swept through the island, making progress until every position was taken out and the airfield was secure, all while losing a great deal of men in the process. The relentless Japanese never seemed to quit, even when surrounded and death or capture was imminent. It is estimated that just under 5,000 Japanese troops had fought on the island, and only 17 were ever taken alive. Of the 18,000 Americans that landed, 1,000 will be killed and just over 2,000 wounded. Although at first what sounds like an unnecessary loss of life for such a small piece of territory, the Battle of Tarawa and the lessons learned there from both sides would change the way the rest of the war in the Pacific would be fought. Many of the plans and tactics that the Americans chose for this battle had gone wrong due to one reason or another. The naval and air bombardment had ended up proving to be extremely inefficient, as well as the lack of proper communication between naval and air raids in the moments of the initial landing. They miscalculated the low tides and fell victim to underwater mines that destroyed many vehicles several yards from shore. This led to the creation of underwater demolition teams that would first be used in the Marshall Islands campaign. The Americans had also greatly underestimated Japan's resilience and willfulness to fight to the death, on top of the fact that their elaborate, well built fortifications almost seemed impossible to get them out of. As for the Japanese, there were also a few major setbacks that eventually led to their defeat on the island. Despite having a well thought out initial surprise attack on the first day, they were unsuccessful at keeping the Americans at the water's edge like they planned. On top of this, they had failed to take out a large number of Americans on the beach, which was their last chance from keeping the Allies from organizing and moving inland. The Japanese believed that their bunkers and pillboxes were truly indestructible, being further reinstated after surviving the pre invasion bombardment. They would soon be proven wrong with this idea once the Marines were able to get up close, using tanks, flamethrowers, and satchel charges to destroy them and wipe out anyone inside. However, the largest setback, and the one that would have them struggling the most, would be the fact that their communication systems were cut off and destroyed in the bombing before the Marines even landed. This put them in an unbelievably desperate position before the battle even truly started. These many mistakes by both sides would cost lots of men, weapons, and resources. But there'd be a lot of things they got right that they would use in future invasions. The Allies had learned that their Amtraks were of great use to them when it came to beach landings as opposed to Higgins boats, which allowed them to trek through any type of terrain they would come across. The Marines also excelled at the ability to collect themselves into new organized units after the chaotic landings did not go as planned, causing several Amtraks to veer off course. Certain Marines also did a fantastic job of assuming leadership in the event that a commander would be killed in combat. The constant landing of reinforcements to either aid or relieve American troops would end up being hugely beneficial, primarily in the Pacific, since this is where soldiers would experience severe battle fatigue from constant random attacks from the enemy day and night. The use of the flamethrower would prove to be the best way to flush out strong enemy positions as opposed to explosives or firepower. This weapon would help the US win several battles in the Pacific, and its true potential was shown here at Tarawa. The Japanese would also continue to implement many tactics that they used at this battle. Even though it had ultimately failed to keep the Americans completely off the island, their tactic of holding fire to wait for a surprise attack had worked well and took out many of the first few waves of troops landing in. They would utilize this on other islands, sometimes waiting for Marines to crowd up on the beach before letting off any artillery with a devastating outcome. Also, thousands of Japanese would work tirelessly to make a network of tunnels and shelter for guerrilla tactics against the Allies on almost all the remaining islands. Their main strategy on Tarawa, by staying dug in and waiting for the Americans to come to them, had ended up working much better than a bonsai charge, as they would give up these suicidal tactics soon after. This way, they wouldn't lose so much of their fighting force so quickly, while at the same time, potentially inflicting a massive amount of damage and instilling fear in those sent to dig them out. This horrible battle would be known as one of the major turning points in the Pacific for both sides involved, and would end up changing the outcome of the conflict. It was a new era of warfare never seen or tested before, with much trial and error and deadly mistakes made along the way. However, these men would not die in vain, since conquering Tarawa and taking the airfield was the first crucial step in accelerating the island hopping campaign and pushing their way to Japan's front door.